so much for being such an attentive and a reactive audience. It's been such a pleasure to be here. I really think that we have to thank the organisers, Sol, and of course our founder and director, Lucia, for making such a wonderful talking galleries this time. Now, I know that at the end of the other talking galleries, you were used to having the Adam and Adam summation. This year, Adam couldn't come, Adam Scheffer, but he sends his best wishes to everyone. He has been in contact to find out how it's going. But the great thing is that instead of just getting me and Adam, who you know, we have 3 panelists to talk about it, not just 2. So it's with great pleasure that I'm welcoming Annie, Elizabeth, and Tim. You've already seen Tim and Elizabeth. Annie is, of course, also a long-standing member of our committee and a supporter of Talking Galleries. And what we're going to do is we're not really going to summarize each panel, but we're going to discuss what we've learnt, what surprised us, and that's what I'm going to do immediately. I'm going to throw out to you the first question. What was the most important thing, your takeaways? And let's start with Annie on my left.
Well, first of all, I think it was, again, a very exciting talking galleries, and it's, I think, for a gallerist, it's very nice to, stop a little bit and just think about our own profession, and this is a unique opportunity for that. And actually, I found basically all presentations very exciting and very informative, and there is something I could get from all of them. But just start with the first one. Emmanuel Perotin was, I think, he gave us a very kind of motivating talk, and which was like the takeaway for me personally is that this gallery business was actually always a difficult one, and now like the galleries of my generation, we can say like mid-market galleries or mid-level or emerging galleries, we always complain and we have all the problems we are facing. But then I was thinking and I realized that this business was always very difficult, and actually new technology helps a lot. It was kind of really fascinating to hear how this business worked without the internet, working with faxes and envelopes and all these things. So we have now many tools, but we have to learn how to use them. And actually, I was remember of one of the first presentation, or it was maybe a panel, when Klaas Nordenhake was talking about being a gallerist and the values which are important. And actually, this I think it's not really changing. I think that we have the same values, but yeah, we have to actually face many challenges, and that was actually quite fascinating to see this 30 years. And expansion is, for example, very important for galleries, to build good system, work with good team. So basically, these are the highlights of his talk, and it was a kind of humorous way as well. And yeah, he said that gallery business was always a gambling. I think that's what he said, and in a way it is, yes. And yeah.
And I'm totally asking for the password to the manager software as well.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
How about you, Elizabeth?
I mean, I think it was such a great 2 days on so many levels. I think this is my 3rd or 4th time having the opportunity to be here. And it is always my favorite 2 days after the new year, where you can come and work on your organization rather than working in your organization. And it's an opportunity to also figure out who the thinkers are in the field. And it always forms new friendships and collaborations in that sense. And I would say that the really big success of this year's edition was that so many of the topics in the 2 days were very headline, urgent, and relevant, and brought in a lot of different key stakeholders in publishing and technology, social media, things that are typically would not be in the realm 5 or 10 years ago of the most important topics for galleries to discuss together. And I think, if anything, the quality of the speakers who have been studying this and writing on these topics from fields that are overlapping with ours, particularly in media and journalism, has helped bring a quality to the conversation that just keeps growing with every passing year. With regard to the commonalities between all of these different sectors of the art world, now that we have sectors in the art world for the first time, it's been interesting because there's a lot of common ground, more than I was expecting. I would say the 4 themes for me, takeaways, were about the value of experiences and how important that is becoming for all of us, regardless of whether we're working on the technological side or the exhibition and curatorial side, or the developing fairs and events. Also, just the importance of dialogue and discourse, and that almost equaling the importance of the producing of exhibitions. And I think that is going to continue in the coming year, and I think in the coming years as we have a slight paradigm shift. I think we were in a high production capacity these last 10 years with globalization, and it was produce, content, and not that that's not going to continue, but I think we are seeing a recalibration in every field. And just also, how do we come together as a community that cares and shares this common ground and redefines success? Whether it's Claire McAndrew talking about how we look at gender inequality in the art market, maybe we need to think about what factors are contributing to that metric of measurement, and thinking sociologically and expanding the dialogue beyond the data to have more dynamic understandings of that data. Or how do we look at things in different ways so that we can bring in and open up the dialogue even further? But I think if there's one big takeaway, I would say it's that we all, more now than ever, want to forecast the future, and we want to future-proof it as much as possible.
My turn?
Yes.
All right. Why does everybody laugh about that? Let me start off by saying that I apologize in advance to all my colleagues in the press, because in theory I am up here to represent you. And so the fact that you're going to be associated with whatever deranged nonsense comes out of my mouth over the course of the next hour, I'm sorry. In terms of takeaways, here's what I would say. I think that I would kind of piggyback on something that Elizabeth was referring to, but from maybe a slightly different perspective, which is that in a lot of ways it felt to me like what we were talking about. Well, we talk a lot about this idea of a middle market crisis or a gallery crisis or whatever, and what I think that we're really talking about more broadly is kind of an identity crisis within the art industry or the art world more broadly. I mean, in all these different ways, we are kind of looking at a group of people who are trapped in a scenario where we're dealing with a very culturally driven enterprise, the production of art, the presentation of art, and that has a certain set of values attached to it. But that's now also happening in this economy that has become extremely cutthroat. The money is so big that you sort of have to think about it in a different way. And that ends up leading to all of these really interesting and kind of high-stakes conflicts of, well, how do you... Like, we're all looking for solutions, in a way, right? But there are solutions that might work and might allow you to continue to be in business, but I think it also raises all these sorts of ethical and existential questions about, like, well, is that the way that I want to succeed? If I can keep being in business that way, but, like, what do I have to sacrifice in order to do that from, like, a values standpoint? And that, I think, is just an endlessly difficult question. But, I mean, that's why this is hopefully an important forum, so that we can get into these kinds of things and hear different perspectives and hopefully maybe think about the issues in a way that we weren't before.
Actually, I thought that it was universally excellent. I was very interested in the presentation by Eugenio, and to pick up on what you say about looking for solutions, I thought what was great about his presentation is that sometimes these presentations, they just say the situation is terrible, the middle market is being hollowed out, and oh woe, oh woe. instead of which he offered some solutions. He looked at other industries to find solutions, and one of the ones was talking to art fairs and trying to get some sort of working together and having a sanction as well, which is important, because it's all very well to lay down some sort of an ethics code, but if you can't punish somebody who contravenes it, then you have no teeth. And I wondered, Elizabeth, perhaps, how did you react to that?
I really loved his presentation for so many reasons. I think first he was really, to me, thinking next generationally about the value of experience, and some of the solutions to some ongoing challenges of these ongoing tensions that we have in our field, whether it be opacity and transparency or culture and business, and where do you fall on that spectrum, and where do you represent yourself, and what territory do you grow into, and what is being gained, what ground is gained and what ground is not gained. I think just naturally leads itself to bring up some of these questions about vertical collaborations, and how intergenerationally we probably need to come together and discuss how the relevancy of today and what artists need to be introduced. Do we really have a good system for introducing artists now, and are galleries and fairs the only solution, or is it the way these things interact with each other, these cultures interact with each other, and can there be more best practices? Can there, all the things that help keep a sustainable innovation? I think one of my favorite slides was his slide about big pharma.
Yes.
Because that was so great. And it's funny because I was over the summer talking with somebody in big pharma about what it is to represent talent and to bring new artists forward and to bring them global visibility when the stakes are so high, as Tim was saying. And she said, this reminds me so much of my field. And, really? And you have, she said, rarely do you have the big pharma able to develop new drugs. It is something that, independent entrepreneurial organizations of scientists develop new drugs. So they have, they operate and coexist and then interrelate in a much more formalized way because it's multinational corporations doing this kind of thing. So I thought, and he brought up the music model, Eugenio as well, yes. Which I think it was one of the first cultural industries to go through this kind of disruption yes. that we are going through. And I think all of this is very, very useful, and I think we should speak more. I think there could be a whole day conference just on some of the topics that he brought up, but I'm very inspired by the project.
And the football model as well.
The
which,
model.
To be fair, has been discussed at previous.
Yeah. Yes.
That's one of the ones. And Tim, particularly as you wrote an excellent book about technology and its impact on the art market, we had two amazing presentations, one by Judge Faye and the other one by, I'm going to have a complete blank, the one afterwards, by you. And I would like to, this impact of technology is so important. Is the art world really keeping up with it? We also had,
Well, I was talking to somebody earlier today about this, and I think that on the one hand, it's really encouraging in a sense that we in the art market are looking out and saying, like, well, maybe we don't have all the answers. Maybe we should start looking at other industries or other people who have tried to do things that look like they're working. So I think that that's valuable. At the same time, I think that what's really important to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about big tech, is that big tech especially is in its own crisis moment right now, where we're talking about things like violations of privacy, like yes. massive hacks, whether or not like Google needs to be broken up, all those types of things. So I think that it's really important in a lot of ways to make sure that when we're talking about something that's outside of our particular specialty in the art world, that we make sure that we understand the full context of what's happening, because it would be a mistake, I think, in some ways to say like, oh, well, we can just model ourselves after what's worked in the startup economy. And if you look at the startup economy, in a lot of ways, it's even worse than what's happening to like small galleries and whatever. So it's tricky. It sort of exists on both levels. Like there are ideas that are valuable there, and at the same time there are also like a whole other set of dangers that we need to be aware of.
But do you think they could impact on a smaller gallery? Do you think that everyone should be aware of these dangers?
I mean, I think that, and granted, I'm completely biased in this, but I think that technology is having an impact on just the way that we live our lives, period. Just in every valence. It's affecting how we experience art. It's affecting how we communicate with one another. It's affecting how we date one another, who we find as life partners and all that stuff, as much as I hate to use the word life partners, and I can't believe it just came out of my mouth. But it's just seeped into so many aspects of the way that we live our lives and the way that we consume things that it has to affect everybody. Like, there's no way... If you think that... as much as I hate to make an extreme statement, like, if you think that technology isn't going to affect the way that you do things because you're too small, like, I promise you that that's wrong. It's just... Because it's certainly affecting, like, mom and pop shops who sell whatever. I mean, pick anything. It's run a lot of those businesses out of the game in a lot of the same ways we're talking about with smaller galleries. So yeah, it's in a lot of ways it's the same issues as we're seeing in broader cultural contexts, and I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Actually, sorry, go ahead.
I would just piggyback on what Tim was saying. I think galleries have always spent a lot of time on research, but it's been about researching artists, and now we have all this information about what collectors are doing and what behavioral patterns museums are taking and how they're communicating. And so I think the shift might be, or at least I hope, is that this provides even more specific information that can serve those of us that are trying to kind of constantly have a work in progress organization in any level to do that kind of research. Because, as GJ was saying, we have, data is the oil of the 21st century.
Yes. Yeah.
But of course, when I see data sets, I just want to have conversation and process that data, which is a whole other activity. And I hope that, its scale isn't a determining factor on the opportunity to do that.
Annie, I noticed that you asked me about Georgina, how to pronounce her name, so I imagined that you wanted to say something about her.
Yeah, actually, the presentation was really great, and I think that I had to realize that I have to focus on more on these kind of technical issues, like in Instagram. Somehow I'm coming from Budapest, and Facebook plays a more important role than in Instagram. I don't know what's the reason for that, but
really?
I think it's it's the art community is really like getting all information from Facebook.
From Facebook.
That's I think it's
just where you come, just your country, just Hungary, or from
Hungary,
your region?
I would say maybe also the region has a stronger focus on like Facebook as well, but Hungary for sure. So all the exhibition events and everything is like we communicate very intensively on Facebook, and I think that we have to focus more on Instagram, as my gallery is also present internationally on many fairs, and we have collectors. So that's something, and I personally not on Instagram, so I decided that I am going to be on Instagram. I just somehow went. And there was a sentence which I wrote. She said that artificial intelligence will displace 40% of the world's jobs in 15 years. And that was a sentence which was really shocking for me. It's, of course, hard to imagine how it will influence the art business, but maybe not that much. But for sure, it's something. It's a very, very strong statement. And but on the other hand, there was another sentence by Kenny. He said that nothing can substitute to stand in front of an artwork. So which was really great in these 2 days, that there were different opinions, and we can confront these ideas, and that's
so remaining sort of on the online internet theme, I thought that one of the presentations, which was extremely well done, but which was possibly controversial for this audience, was that by unit.
Yeah.
Have you any thoughts about that?
I think it's interesting to see that when there is a presentation or there is somebody's talking about a different way of doing this business, then there are always strong reactions. So this business is very protective, and I think many of us would like to keep this on a like a high level and protect the values. And it was interesting to see rather the reactions.
I have
It's
very strong opinions about this
Please
presentation.
go ahead.
to be honest, it
I-
was,
Am I the only
happened
one?
before.
Elizabeth, I don't have strong opinions about anything.
Lots of questions.
Well, yes.
From the publishing panel, which was to me very, very interesting,
Excellent.
I went back and looked up a word I hadn't thought about a long time that was brought up there, but I linked it back to his presentation, which is the word prosumer.
Prosumer, yes.
Which began in the 80s. And I thought, you know what? This is in a way, an endpoint on an aspect of that concept. Where you can literally work the connection between the creator, the artist, and the consumer. I wouldn't even call it a collector-based exercise in a traditional sense, and eliminate the traditional gallery and the system around academia and museums and critical, art criticism out of the equation. At least that was my takeaway. So, of course, I'm asking 1,000 questions as a result of that presentation. As much as I believe in the power of storytelling, I do believe artists are the originators of those stories. Our job is to be the proxy for their stories as gallerists. And then I think, journalism and criticism is to ask the questions and to keep the discourse going, which then can create a certain kind of, objective territory in which to discuss and either have consensus or have debate. And Instagram, as important of a tool as it is, does not replace that process for me in any way, shape, or form. And I think it invalidates a lot of the deep thinking that can occur around works of art. I question whether a model that Joe's advocating for could even exist 10 years ago or will exist in 10 years' time. It feels very tied to the phenomena of Instagram.
But then you're assuming that Instagram will not be with us in 10 years, or some other technology will replace it?
I don't know. I mean, I don't hold a crystal ball, but I do feel that this is a particular time in the era of Instagram that we're experiencing, of which it will not stay in the position it is in. It will change in some way. We don't know how. There are lots of forces that will determine that are beyond Instagram's control. But it does feel like that. And so, I start to ask, what's the criteria for things like quality and originality? And how do we further a canon of art when we have to be quick and fast and consumer focused on every level? Those questions come up. And then, of course, how do you protect creative talent? How do you foster it? How do you, I still firmly and will always believe that talent, is best supported when there is agents involved, i.e. galleries. It does kind of bring up a lot of uneasy questions about opacity and transparency, about the scale versus value. These tensions have been around for a very long time, but when you have a project like that, I think you really do speak to that pretty directly.
And Tim, did you have any? You say you don't have strong opinions?
Never. Well, I think that, first off, I'm going to say that I thought Joe's presentation was interesting, partially because of the emotions that it brought out of the crowd.
Yes,
in
yeah.
some cases, not that I'm thinking
Yeah.
of anyone in particular when I say that, but I think it also points to there are a lot of kind of issues that came out of it. One for me is this notion that I have thought about a lot, which is, to what extent can you actually analogize the art market and the experience of art to other things like tech? And a lot of I'll just say I'm not going to, I'm not trying to pass any kind of judgment on Joe's business, because I understand where he's coming from, and I would like to have a longer conversation with him to make sure I fully understand what he's doing. But within that, a lot of the examples that he was using in terms of why he was making the decisions he was making were things like Netflix and the Nike ID, which is their customized branding product line. And those things are certainly succeeding on some level, but they're also a very different type of, I hate to use the word product, but in this strict sense, product, in that they are all mass market things. I mean, Netflix succeeds by getting massive volume. They want a huge amount of customers, and you pay very little in order to be able to partake of their services. And that's not what the traditional art world offers. I mean, it's still a business that is very much about offering very few relatively high-value objects for individual sale. And that's a completely different business model. And so on one hand, you can look at that and say, well, then maybe the things that Unit is doing don't really apply to what many other galleries are doing. On the other hand, you can also say, well, they seem to be having some success doing what they're doing, so what does that tell us about the audience? Does it tell us that there is a wider audience out there that maybe wants to experience art in a different way than what we're used to in terms of putting on gallery shows or holding art fairs or whatever? And if that's the case, is that something that each of us individually wants to engage with or not? Because this is something that I think about a lot in terms of, we talk about growth in the art market a lot. And I am skeptical as to how much growth there actually really is. Like, it seems like the growth means a few people paying a lot more money every year. And that's very different than saying the art market is expanding because it's bringing in a whole mess of new people to become stakeholders in any capacity. And so if you have a huge number of people out there who aren't ever going to be able to afford or don't want to pay whatever, $10,000 even every few months to keep buying artwork, but they want to be involved somehow, like, well, how do you serve those people? Do you want to serve those people? And if the traditional art world doesn't do that, then who does? Does this kind of parallel structure build up? I mean, it's not the same thing, but you can sort of think about it in terms of like street art versus more traditional kind of high-end art. There are a lot of people that I know who look down at street art and say, like, oh, it's just kind of like a mass market sort of lowbrow thing. But there's also a huge demand for it out there. And I mean, now you've got the Gagosian shop selling like Jean-Michel Basquiat skateboards.
Well,
So
I also think that there have always been a lot of different art worlds. I mean, if anyone that goes to Miami Beach in December goes to those 20 fairs, it will tell you there are parallel universes there that have their own marketplaces that we know nothing about. And, I assume there are communities of artists who are driving that. So my question is, why is this something we should look at right now? Is it because of the social media aspect, or because it's a provocation to the traditional art world in a way that some of those other platforms and markets have not tried to kind of take on? Or is it just, what is the agenda in bringing that conversation forward right now? I always just ask that question in an open way.
I think partly it's in the context of this problem of the middle market, the middle and the smaller galleries. And so therefore looking at other models, I think that, how other people, I would have said that was probably the thinking. But it's true what you say, these parallel art markets, because it's not one market. There's lots of different markets, have always existed. But shall we move on? One of the things that I was very interested in, and this was rather depressing, was Claire McAndrew's report on the position of women artists.
Yes.
And her framing the debate at the beginning with all these rather depressing figures was really interesting. And then even the African art panel that we've just had, it turns out that although it looks as if women are doing better, they're actually not doing that much better either.
Well, I think the figures were really important, and I think it's great that she's doing that, and we should be aware of these facts. I'm not sure how we can, do about it, because I think for a gallery it's quite like a natural way to, get new artists, and I never look at the gender. Sometimes I had more female artists than, like it's about the half of the artists are female and half male, but that's not like it's like you search for quality, and so it's difficult. But that was really shocking. The numbers, like 50% at the auctions, at least 50%. The prices are 50% less than for male, but which was really promising that in terms of the younger generation, the galleries represent like 43% of female artists. Yes. So I think it will probably change. And on the other hand, when we saw this African panel, you can see that like in many countries, female artists have better positions. And also, for example, in Hungary, like one of the best internationally acknowledged artists is Dora Maurer, is female. Well, Elizabeth knows a lot about Hungarian art. So, I mean, if I see the examples, then I see, many female artists treated in a really great way and having great success. But the numbers were really shocking, actually.
But they are moving in the right way.
Yes.
I think it's
Can we be
improving,
positive about that?
But on the other hand, in the evening we went to Magba, and there was this artwork by Guerrilla Girls. And I can't remember. It's like a very tiny percent of the artworks in the Met Museum are from female artists.
Or in the National Gallery in London.
Yes.
I mean,
so that was kind of interesting that this conversation has been going on for a while. But I think it's changing. Like that's what I think.
I mean, as a woman, are you surprised? No, not really. I mean, the big radical shift for me in Claire's report was this moment where she described the inequality, and that it hasn't grown, it hasn't balanced as much as we would have thought, given the fact that we're kind of in a moment where women are being historicized to a certain degree or rediscovered. But ultimately, going from the emerging to the established is where there's a big dropout. And that just seeing that is always a sobering moment, but not a surprising one. And, I think it was Vanessa who, brought up the fact that in, Brazil and particularly South American marketplaces, women have a much bigger market share on the established market. And then we just saw that today with, a real deep dive into the African market and looking at those numbers. And that to me is, and then in Eastern Europe, we have the women who were really politically so radical and brave in their work, and you have them as some of the market leaders now. I think we do need to go back to Claire's original question, which is, can we look sociologically and maybe geopolitically at why women lead in areas that are outside the centers, and are there ways in which we can kind of break that down without over kind of simplifying or making too obvious a criteria for why things are valued, why characteristics are valued the way they're valued in visual art. And I thought I would love to see more of her work in that area, and I'd love to see more analysis of her data in that area. And I think she's motivated to bring that forward.
I think some is coming out in March, isn't it?
Yeah,
Some
and I
more.
think it would be also interesting to examine a little bit the female, I mean, the galleries, the percentage of female and male galleries, because I believe, I never seen these kind of figures, but I believe that from the periphery, like Eastern Europe, there are more female galleries than in the traditional, the area where the market is strong and has a big tradition of
Is that partly, my husband comes from Poland, and
many female galleries in Poland.
but also I think because, I mean, he's of a generation, I mean, he was brought up under communism, there was really much more equality, actually.
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah.
Much more equality when he came to England.
There were not too many advantages of this socialist
Yes,
communist system in
one.
these countries, but that was one that, you know, women could be like truck drivers and
well,
police,
they were, and doctors, there were
everything.
more
Yeah,
doctors
and
than-
I think somehow I don't see it such a big problem at the moment. I mean, we have many problems in Hungary, but not not
That's
this,
not one of them.
Not that's
Actually,
but that I would love to see these kind of figures, and I think that at this point, which I lacked a little bit during the 2 days, that I think it's very interesting to analyze a little bit the geographical differences, because that gives another perspective to think about this whole.
we tend to be
yeah.
focused too much on our US, which is. I did think actually it was interesting something that Vanessa said, which was that she saw that male technicians were doing much better than.
Yeah, that was interesting.
That was an interesting point.
Yeah.
Actually, and that women tended to do in administrative jobs and didn't earn nearly so much, and the men did much better, which is an aspect I had never thought about really.
Yeah, I'm curious about that because I don't know if it's a UK versus US or at least LA thing, because like, I mean, I worked in the LA gallery world for 8 years, and every technician I knew was still paid like crap. So I'm not saying that Vanessa is wrong. I would like to dig deeper into that. Yeah, it does speak to the survivorship bias, to use a technical term, that aspect brings into play. I think is really interesting because to see that at when artists are at an emerging stage and there's not exact parity between men and women's presence in the market, but it's a lot closer. And then the fact that once you get to a quote-unquote established stage, however you define that, then the disparity really jumps up. And so part of it is, again, just the idea of being able to figure out a way to stay in the game, to keep making art, to kind of keep putting your work out there. And that raises all kinds of questions in terms of, like, yeah, certainly the economy has a lot to do with it. Like, how do you manage to keep making money if you're not selling work? Because the reality is that most people aren't. And even when you're selling emerging, like when you're at an emerging level and you're selling work at that level, it's not like you're not driving a Rolls Royce or something like that. I mean, you're probably still scraping by, doing odd jobs, whatever else. It's hard.
And you also have this, internal, all of us have an internal bias, even women, about gender inequality. So, you have to have this consciousness all the time. Like, even if there are a lot of women gallerists, I would have loved to see the statistic of how many women gallerists there are today versus in years past. But it doesn't necessarily guarantee that more women will be represented in galleries. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that the pricing structure is equal of how, artists at the same stage in their career, irrespective of gender, are treated. These things it's once you start looking at this complexity of this issue, and you can also say that with racial diversity as well, how, are we we don't have a standard of, we don't have a way to kind of track that code of ethics about equality in the primary marketplace, representing artists and their value, or setting their value, or having representation that is representing the world and the landscape. And maybe it's time, since there is such an interest in looking at it more closely now, maybe we need to seize this moment and actually start having those conversations also.
Yeah. We also were treated to a conversation between Simon de Pury and Kenny Schachter. They've both had to leave, so you can say what you like.
Were you the one that was having the conversation?
Although this is recorded. be fair.
What?
Come to think of it.
So you just want me to? Do you want to ask anything more specific? Because there's a lot of things I could say about that conversation.
You don't have to say anything.
No.
Did
I mean, I
anybody
think
have a reaction?
I think that one of the aspects of hearing Kenny and Simone speak is just that obviously both of them have been a part of the art world for a long time.
Yes.
I mean, I think Kenny said 30 years, Simone
40 years.
even longer than that. Yeah. And one of the things that if people who have been around that long, I think if they're really going to be valuable to people who are younger, however much younger, they have to be willing to be honest about what their experiences were. And I mean, I think that Kenny, and he would be the first to tell you, certainly has his detractors, to put it mildly.
Put it mildly, yes.
But you certainly can't say that he's not giving you his unvarnished opinion about what things are, like the way that things are, and the way that things maybe should be, or whatever else. So from that perspective, I think that it was great to have him up there. I mean, I was very happy with that conversation. Again, I'm super biased because I was the one who was moderating it. But another thing that I thought was noteworthy to come out of that was Simone, who has been around for as long as he has been, was one of the most enthusiastic people I talked to over the course of the past 48 hours about like new business models and technology.
Yes.
And he was, I mean, I had a conversation with him about like virtual reality afterwards. And that's not something that I was anticipating coming in. And I mean, I think that that's something that's worthwhile to see that somebody who has been through as much as he has to still be curious and still be looking for what the next thing is. I mean, hopefully that's to some degree inspiring, I would hope.
Absolutely. I think they should
yes.
take it on the road. I think there should be T-shirts. There should be cities on the back of the T-shirts.
Show.
Yeah, I could see people buying tickets. It could be a Broadway show at some point. You know, I think they could take this to another level. I think this is they're only getting started. What I love is they're both such entrepreneurial minds.
Yes.
They are insatiably curious about the future.
Yes.
And it's great to see them both find their footing now at these stages in their careers. I mean, Kenny reminded me when we were at the coffee break that he actually has been writing this column since the early 90s on the art world. But it seems like it's had somewhat of a viral kind of following in the last, 3-5 years? What would you say?
Something
10?
like that,
Something
yeah. I
like
would say
that.
probably.
Yeah. So it's sort of like sometimes, we had to catch up with Kenny, in some ways. And that was great to see. I really enjoyed what they had to say.
Yeah, and I mean, look, just not to sound like a narcissist, but I mean, the fact that Kenny has the following that he does was part of the reason that I started doing what I do. It's like,
amazing.
like somebody can talk about this very kind of insider baseball aspect of the art market, but do it in a way that makes it entertaining enough that people actually want to read it. Because, I mean, Georgina, you may disagree with me, but art market coverage can be a little dry sometimes.
Surely
Occasionally.
not.
Right. So the idea that you can present something in a way that can actually sort of give it an energy that makes it more than just like a business column was super influential, and I think hopefully that's something that more people can take something out.
Energy is the very apt word for both of them.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that Simon de Pury said that what he still likes doing is going to artists' studios. That's wonderful that he still has that enthusiasm and that energy after all of these years. So I'd like to ask all three of you a question. Is there anything that changed an opinion that you had on any of the topics that we discussed?
Well, new technology and Instagram,
Yeah.
definitely
Instagram
I have
in your
to,
case, yes.
I have to take. But also that many of the speakers mentioned the role of education, and I think that's I think it's a must for galleries to educate new audience, and a lesson for me that I think I need a completely different approach towards the younger, potential younger collectors, because yes, because I feel myself connected rather to like the mid-generation collectors, and I think it's completely different, And there are some really interesting things in my countries. For example, 2 years ago, somebody started a collectors academy, which means that they do courses for people who are interested in art, but they never had a connection. And which is interesting that. Now there are 4 different companies offering these kind of courses.
Really?
So I think that education is really important, and especially important in these regions where, like we don't have this.
Where there's less of an infrastructure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So and it's interesting. I'm invited sometimes to give lectures, and it's nice to see the enthusiasm that people are really trying to find a way to the art scene, but it's quite difficult. And as I said, Instagram is not that popular in Hungary as far as I'm concerned. And I think this. So we have to find new ways. And
that's great.
Yeah.
So Instagram plus approaching your younger collectors in a
Yes,
different way. That's
and also
interesting.
that one more thing is that I think the local audience is very important. I think Emmanuel said in the beginning that they closed one of the branch because there was not
They
enough
closed Miami.
audience.
Yes,
Miami.
they closed Miami.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I
that
think
was
it's also-
interesting.
yeah. That
It was interesting that he signalled it out, actually, because he could have just remained on all the successes. He doesn't see it as a failure, incidentally, at all. He's very clear it was not, but it just wasn't corresponding to what he wanted to do, and they just didn't have enough people, so they weren't educating enough.
Yeah.
And you can't be everywhere. I think Asia was coming up at that time, and he had a decision to make, given the fact that he represents, Murakami and so many artists in that region. And I mean, for me, I think I love the publishing panel. It was one of my favorites, just because I saw so many parallels and dichotomies between this kind of optimism around supporting artists, and then also the deep need to not only archive these conversations that are happening, but have these debates. And I started to realize, with a little bit of this recalibration that we're undergoing, there's more in common with publishing in all of its forms in the art sector, whether it be in-house with I thought what JJ said was very, very interesting about how, artists, galleries that are publishing journals or magazines, that's nothing new. It dates back all the way to the 60s and 70s, and I'd love to go back and do more study about that time period. And, just that we are in this 50-year period where contemporary art is now, that old, and we can look back and we can think through that, and it's kind of an interesting time. Yet, because we are using fairs, particularly as community gatherings, in the way that we're using at this conference as a community gathering, and because publishing has moved so much into doing live events, particularly recently, particularly the arts magazines like Art Review, there's an opportunity, I think, for fairs and independent publishers who have a critical point of view that needs to be protected can come together and do more together. And I think that we'll see more of that, or at least I hope so. And I hope we'll see more galleries doing journals, and also doing some more scholarship on some of the artists, and commissioning more writing about the exhibitions that they're doing back at the gallery.
Elizabeth's bringing up the notion of those historical examples that JJ mentioned about gallery publications, and even when on the same panel when Jane talked about how the first digital revolution was actually really great for publishing.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that what those, for me at least, speak to is the idea that it's really helpful to go back and look at not just what things worked, but how they worked, because we've spent a lot of time over the course of the past 2 days kind of envisioning where we want the art market to go in various ways, whether it's more transparency or vertical collaborations or whatever else. And it's great to go out and find examples of other industries or the people who've managed to do that. But in some ways, I almost think that the what is less important than the how. It's like, okay, well, to go back to Eugenio's example of the kind of collaboration between, was it Sony and Octone, I think? Smaller label.
Yes.
So that question becomes like, okay, yeah, that model looks like it would work, but like, how did that conversation start? or like what was the beginning of FIFA? Like how did these clubs decide they were going to come together and have this conversation? Because I think that it's not just a matter of galleries, especially trying to figure out like, well, what do we do? It's like, okay, well, how do we organize this? How do we get together? How do we have these conversations? And that's got to be something that happens beyond just symposiums and conferences or whatever else.
I think what we agree on is that galleries are the innovators, and then multinational galleries are still galleries, but they are doing a different kind of work.
Yeah.
And so the possibility for recontextualizing things, which is what you were saying, the how, is really, we already have the toolbox. It just needs to be reorganized, perhaps. I don't, and maybe we do need to look to other fields, but ultimately we're not a purely commercial space, nor are we of the scale where we can completely just replicate a model that's out there. We actually have the tools to do it. I think it's just a matter of having, I think that's why these discussions have been so interesting. And also, I think Emmanuel did such an amazing job with his keynote in breaking down commonly held assumptions about what those galleries of scale really do. I think that was an incredibly leveling kind of conversation where he really wasn't about promoting his, as you said, his victories, of which there have been many,
yes.
but it was really just about sharing the challenges all the way through and the belief system that's gotten him up in the morning every day. And I think some of the young and emerging galleries really see him differently and the gallery differently now, realizing exactly how it was in the 90s when he started, or 1989, I guess it was, or 1990, and how things have evolved, and how so many of the problems that we're dealing with today are still with us. They just have a different form or a different context. So
I was also very touched by Emmanuel's, the way he spoke about his team.
Yeah.
I thought that was it was a very nice thing to do. And when he explained how he had this accident and that he had to pass over to his team and how he really relies on his team and how he treats them, I thought that was it was a very human aspect of his presentation, because he's become, a very well-known gallerist, and he might have been a little bit more personal about it, but not at all. He really paid tribute to his team, and that was something I thought was very touching.
And I thought that the motorcycle accident aspect was interesting too, because it lines up with something Elizabeth just said about how we shouldn't really necessarily anticipate that models for change are going to come from big galleries.
Yeah.
Like you very rarely see people change things in substantial ways when things are going really well.
Yeah.
I mean, why would they? It's like they're succeeding as is. But on even like a small scale way, the fact that Emmanuel had a motorcycle accident put him in a situation where the thing that he was doing was no longer viable, and he had to figure out another way to come up with an answer. And that, like, weirdly ended up leading to kind of a wholesale reorganization of how he thinks about his business. And I mean, that's something that, in a weird way, is maybe kind of an optimistic note for galleries or anybody else who's out there struggling in the world. It's like, well, yeah, when things are going poorly, like it's sort of a message to you that this is the moment that you have to try to figure something out. And that pressure sucks in a lot of ways, but it can also be the thing that you need to really like prioritize the notion of, we got to figure something out.
So it's really rather nice, because we've sort of come full circle. We started with Emmanuel's presentation, and we've come back to it at the end. Is there anything else I noticed that you've all got notes. Is there anything that you wanted to say?
Art fairs was, of course, again, a topic. We didn't really talk about this now, but I think it's something we should discuss for days. And it is certainly a big pressure on galleries.
Yes.
And I don't see how to solve it, because coming from, especially from a kind of periphery area, I would say, I find it very important to be on art fairs, but I think it's the same for galleries in the more center areas. So we have to be there, but on the other hand, these are enormous pressure and costs and everything. So, but I don't see the solution at the moment.
I think we have to think about whether it's fairs, auctions, the media, tech, I think we have to just take a big step back and say, how do we empower the innovators and the talent? That's, to me, I think as long as we go back to that fundamental question and think about it under the backdrop of the here and now and where we might be in 5 years' time, where we might be in a decade or the next generation, I think we will find that whether it's the gallery, innovating its format or diversifying itself, or the fair, or everything that's in the middle space between the artist and the collector or the museum, these boundaries are not fixed. And they are the end result of, they were organized by people who came together to do something at a certain point in time, and there is no reason why we can't continuously and always do a health check on these things and think about new ways that might make things better for those that want to innovate in that space.
Similarly, the panel about the contemporary African art scene, I thought was really encouraging
really
in the
great.
sense
So
of,
good.
well, this is something that I think about a lot from the press perspective, is that we talk about the idea of a global art world, right? But realistically, we're just not paying the same amount of attention to places like the entire African continent. Or, I mean, you can pick any number of examples, but I mean, just for instance, the Taipei Dangdai just happened, first time ever. And so, of course, like everybody who's in the art press, I mean, my publication included, was like, okay, well, we have to cover this week. Then when do we go back to it? Next year?
Yeah.
When some other thing happens,
and we
it's
forget
like that's
Taiwan in between.
right,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
And like it's understandable, because from a press perspective, you need pegs to hang things on. So in theory, you need events or news or whatever to really bring it to the public's attention. But at the same time, I think that one of the things that is sort of fascinating about what Lorato and Turia were saying was that, I mean, the African art world is kind of building itself from the ground up right now. And I would really love to talk to them about like whether that is in some strange ways an opportunity. Like, can you look at some of the problems that the more established art worlds or art markets are having and say, well, okay, that clearly is not something we should do right now. We have an opportunity to not do it. That I think is a really interesting proposition. It's an interesting place to be in, and maybe it would give some of us who are living in more established markets, I mean, something to think about.
Yeah. Well, I think food for thought, so much food for thought, so much to think about. We've come to the end of the 7th edition of Talking Galleries. So next year will be the 8th. Don't forget to put it in your diaries. I don't know if the dates exist already. They do? Yeah. Which? What?
3rd week of January.
3rd week of January, just like this time. There you go. It's been wonderful to be with you and to see you and to interact with you and to make new friends, to find older friends. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to my panel.